This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential. Today we're going to cover the book Mastery, The Keys to Success and Long-Term Fulfillment by George Leonard. Erik is the one who read this book, and he can fill us in much more on what this book is on and who recommended it and lots more. So, Erik, for this, I turn it over to you. And first and foremost, who recommended this book and why in the world did you choose to read a book about mastery?
Terry Laughlin was the one who suggested this book on a pretty impactful episode of the Tim Ferriss Show podcast. Terry was dying of cancer, and his episode with Tim Ferriss was one of the last interviews he ever gave. And I believe Tim did the interview at the hospital, if I recall.
Yeah, as I recall, that's correct.
So Laughlin is known as being the founder of total immersion, and a way to learn how to swim. And he actually taught Tim Ferriss how to swim. Ferriss was scared of the water his whole life, and Laughlin's way of teaching got Tim in the water and got him swimming in a pretty short amount of time. So here's something I found online about Laughlin's unique system. And again, Laughlin passed away last year, October 20th of 2017. So sad death, died pretty relatively young. So here's about his system. Laughlin's system is designed to teach efficiency in the water through balance, streamline, reducing drag, and conserving energy. His methods have been especially geared towards masters, swimmers, and triathletes, who he argued would reap benefits of getting through their swimming section with a low heart rate. I wanted to read that because this ties in very closely with this book, in which he said this is one of the books that had the biggest impact on his life. So, and
actually, and just to say a little bit more about the total immersion system, I mean, what they're trying to do, what you're trying to do in that system is minimize drag in the water, and instead of getting a bunch of strokes really quickly and trying to propel yourself forward, it's to try to get as much out of each stroke by learning to position your body more aerodynamically in the water and to be more efficient as a swimmer, so that you're actually using fewer strokes, but you're propelling yourself much further with each stroke. So that ends up being very efficient for like triathletes and so on to finish their sections with lower heart rate and all that, because you're giving less effort to swim a longer distance and at a faster time, at least at longer distance speeds. You're not going to be winning like the 50 freestyle in the Olympics using that method. But yeah, it's something actually I want to get more, I want to do a little bit more of it personally. As I get a little bit more time to swim in the future, I want to actually apply some of that stuff myself, because I've never really been a great swimmer. And so I want to give it a shot.
Well, and based on the topic of this book, my guess is that system takes a lot of practice. It doesn't sound like it's probably the natural way one would behave in the water. So probably a lot of practice and
a lot of deliberate practice. Probably.
Yeah. So the author of the book is George Leonard. George Leonard recently passed away as well in 2010. He wrote this book in 1992. So, it's a few years old, but still very, very relevant. And Leonard was a professor. He was a writer, an editor, and was an Aikido master. He's a fifth degree black belt in Aikido, which I found that to be interesting because this book reminded me a lot of The Art of Learning, and Josh Waitzkin was also a lot of the lessons that he took and wrote about in the book was also from a particular martial art. And so I found it interesting that both George Leonard and Josh Waitzkin applied a lot of what they write in these books from the discipline of martial arts, and Josh Waitzkin also with chess. But yeah, just an interesting comparison there. So before we get any further, just wanted to remind everyone that we operate on the value for value model. So if you are getting value out of this podcast, hook us up. We're on Patreon, and we have some different options for giving levels, and you can give as little as $1 a month.
You can give as much as 10,000 a month if you want some really amazing perks.
Yeah.
Really amazing.
Which we'll have to define.
That level, oh man. Whew, wow.
So let's get into the book.
It's too bad you all can't see the video right now, because we're recording this, of course, via the wonder of Skype, so I can see video. But Erik, who is rather fair-skinned, is now various shades of pink due to my use of the proximity effect on the mic, which connects with the idea of a very high price paid per month. And apparently Erik was a little uncomfortable with that. But we'll go ahead and pass that over, and we'll get to more about the book itself. So first of all, let's get to the basic idea that this book is getting at. What is mastery, and what's the benefit of reading this book?
All right. Well, the way Leonard defines mastery is that it is the mysterious process during which what is at first difficult becomes progressively easier and more pleasurable through practice. Practice.
We talking about practice, man. What? Not the game. Not the game. We talking about practice, man. Practice.
So
I wonder how many listeners are actually going to get that without an explanation.
Yeah, we may need to put the clip in on that one.
Allen Iverson, everybody.
All right, this book. All right, so it's called Mastery, but there's another book called Mastery out there, which is by Robert Greene. So don't get these two confused. You're probably going to actually see more of the Robert Greene version, and it was actually suggested by a lot more people on the Tim Ferriss Show podcast. Terry Laughlin was the only one that recommended the George Leonard version. So Mastery by Robert Greene, another book, not what we're talking about. We're talking about Mastery by George Leonard. And this one is very short. It's under 200 pages, but the pages are extremely short. I mean, it's like 2 to 3 paragraphs per page. So quick read, and a good book that contained a lot of hints of what we've seen in other books, such as Outliers, The Art of Learning, The Dip by Seth Godin, Thinking Fast and Slow, Getting Things Done, and The War of Art. So I'll talk about how it relates to a few of those books, but yeah, it's basically how can you master something? How can you learn something, and what are the things that get in the way of that, and how can you bypass those things? What are things that you need to look out for in the path to mastery? And very, 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 very well put together. It's broken into 3 parts: the master's journey, the 5 master keys, and tools for mastery. So basically, the path of mastery, it's a path of a patient, dedicated effort without attachment to immediate results.
Gotta love the process. As Nick Saban would say, it's all about the process.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
It's the process. You got to learn to love the process and focus on the process, not the results. And paradoxically, that's the best way to get the best results.
Well, and you should you probably hear a lot of some of the books I mentioned in that, especially Outliers with the dedicated 10,000 hour rule. And so we'll get into some of that. But first wanted to hit on some of the quotes that stuck out to me. And Jason, one of these quotes, I want to see if you can finish it out. So I'll start with that one. A report on the physiological limits of running speed shows that the major factor stopping the improvement of a champion runner's speed is
probably focus on time.
Setting a record or winning an important medal.
Well, there you go. Yeah, winning.
Yeah.
As soon as you start focusing on the outcome, on time, that sort of thing, you get in trouble. You can't focus on the outcome. Got to focus on doing things right to get the outcome.
But isn't that interesting too? Because when you think about it from the breaking the 4-minute mile, like that was such a barrier until Roger Bannister finally did it, and then a bunch of people did it. So it was like that the record in another way, the record kind of set the limit, and people couldn't until it was done. Then it kind of opened up the floodgates, but not before that. So
yeah. Now, what's interesting now is in terms of that, I think that's actually changed to some degree. I think that was the case for a long time. That the major factor was basically trying to focus on specific time or whatever. Now, I think we're running more up against real physiological limitations. And, you can not focus all you want on time and focus on process, but at some level, physics says you actually have to be able to, you're limited by certain laws, certain parameters. So it'll be interesting to see how much improvement we continue to see from here on out and where it goes. And how long before we start getting more asymptotic, and how long before progress effectively stops. I mean, we're already at the point where purportedly there's not been a PED-free participant in the Olympic 100-meter finals since 1980. So we're already really running up against some of that stuff, and that makes a difference.
Yeah, and one thing I did think about while reading this book is with all the wearable devices we have now, if that is going to help or if that will hinder it all. But I tend to think it'll help more, just because we're able to measure things better, and if we're diets are getting better, and all that's combined. But we'll have to see. I'm still curious to see if the 2-hour marathon can be broken.
I think it can.
Really?
I think it can, but I don't think an hour and a half is going to be broken anytime in the next few hundred years.
Yeah.
But that's where we're starting to reach other types of limitations, but I think they'll get to 2 hours. I think that's probably going to happen within the next decade or so.
All right. So here's a few more quotes. In discussing the path of mastery, you'll probably end up learning as much about yourself as about the skill you're pursuing. And isn't that your
question is, do you want to know those things about yourself?
Yeah.
I mean, some of the things you end up learning about yourself in the quest for mastery is painful, at least in my experience.
Yeah, good point. The essence of boredom is to be found in the obsessive search for novelty.
Now, that's a fascinating quote, worth a little bit more unpacking. Say a little bit more about that one.
It's brought up in a point of discussing kind of the monotony of practice, and it may not seem like it's benefiting kind of the daily habits type thing. It may not seem like it's having any sort of an impact, but it is. And if you try to bypass the daily practice, if you try to bypass that and search for a novel way to attempt or to reach a goal, it's not going to have the impact as doing something on a consistent basis and improving and challenging and getting better at it. So it was cool for him to talk about that in the sense of boredom. The essence of boredom is to be found in the obsessive search for novelty. Here's one that you'll probably identify with very closely, Jason. Many people run not to lose weight, but to loosen the chains of a mechanized culture. Not to postpone death, but to savor life.
Or to feel like you're dying. Right? I mean, not to postpone death, but to taste death, to feel like you are dying, right?
All right, I'm going to read one. This one's a little longer, but I think I've actually heard this, and it may have been in one of the other Books of Titans books, but this was excellent. To learn is to change. Education, whether it involves books, body, or behavior, is a process that changes the learner. It doesn't have to end at college, graduation, or at age 40 or 60 or 80. And the best learning of all involves learning how to learn, that is, to change. The lifelong learner is essentially one who has learned to deal with homeostasis simply because he or she is doing it all the time. Thought it was good.
Yeah.
Learning how to learn. A lot of things we've discussed in other episodes, but put it pretty well on that one.
Yeah. I can go with that. And again, I think that actually ties really well with the art of learning, where again, Waitskin talks about how the most valuable lesson you can learn is how to learn, is the most important thing. So it connects very well there.
Yeah. All right, a couple more. We fail to realize that mastery is not about perfection. It's about a process, a journey. The master is the one who stays on the path day after day, year after year. The master is the one who is willing to try and fail and try again for as long as he or she lives.
And actually, if I were going to pick a quote out of, I'm looking at a couple of the ones that you've sent to me, that would be the one that I would say out of all the ones that I've seen from this book, that's the money quote. Mm-hmm. Here. That gets back to, I was just having a conversation on Twitter today with an NFL player who tweeted out something about how you can't be both great and humble at the same time. And I responded back. I shot him a response saying, only somebody who doesn't really know what humility is would say that. Greatness requires humility. And we went back and forth a little bit about that. But my case on that is that the only way that you're going to put in the work necessary to become great is to be humble enough to recognize all the places that you need to improve and that you need to get better, and all the places where you're limited. We've talked about this on the podcast before. I mean, you can be LeBron James and know for a fact that you're the best basketball player on the planet, but you still are constantly working on your craft every day because you know that you've not reached where you want to get. You know that you're still limited. You still have these flaws or weaknesses in your game. You still have these areas that you can improve. You're still listening to this coach on that, and this person over here who's got this contribution to make that you can incorporate. And all of these things, you're still getting better because you're listening. And that's where the master, again, as it says at the end of this quote, the master is the one who's willing to try and fail and try again for as long as he or she lives. And in so doing, that master becomes truly excellent. And that failure, the points of failure get much, much further along the line. There's a whole lot more success that failure has to, that you go through in order to get to the point of failure. And that's when you're truly great. But you have to be humble enough to be willing to fail, and to fail repeatedly to get there. And that's something that's really hard for people. I mean, if you're a proud person, you don't like to fail. And actually, I mean, none of us like to fail. Nobody likes the feeling of failure, but a proud person is going to shy away from it because it's going to make them look or feel bad.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. Well, and for me, the first part of this quote really stuck out. We fail to realize that mastery is not about perfection. When I was growing up in learning violin, it was all about perfection. And so the way I learned violin was it was by books. And so each book would contain 10 songs. And I had to learn those to perfection, and then I would perform those at a concert. And I got up to like book 6 or 7. So over an 11-year period, went through 6 of these books. And it was all about perfection. Like, you perfected the songs, and then you practiced upon that perfection. And so it kind of ingrained in my head this, it's all about the concert. It's all about the event. Like, the mastery is about that perfection. It's not about trying, failing. It was about making it perfect, sound perfectly how it's supposed to sound, like how Bach wrote it or Mozart wrote it. And I've taken that into a lot of other parts of my life, as my wife can attest. And I tend to kind of look for the big event for things and miss the journey part of it, which is the second part of that quote. It's about a process. It's a journey, and it's staying on that path day after day. I tend to just kind of look towards these bigger events instead of the day-to-day. I miss out on the day-to-day. And that can apply to a lot of things, like whether it's my just making sure I'm really spending time with my daughters, or doing the daily practice type things, but instead of thinking like of big events coming up in their lives or something like that. So that's why this one really stuck out to me, and it's something I really try to get over, and not have it be about the profession, but about the process and the day to day.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the point that you get there, you really, truly have a chance to become excellent, to become great at something.
Yeah. Which ties into the last quote. Psychologist Abraham Maslow discovered a childlike quality, he called it a second naivete, in people who have met an unusually high degree of their potential. And I think, Jason, you would agree with that one, just based on other books we've discussed in this series of books.
Yep.
So on to
the nitty gritty.
Some of the deeper things in the book. One is the plateau. And so when George Leonard's talking about the path to mastery, there are going to be inevitable times of plateau where you put in the daily work, you put in the daily practice, day after day, year after year, and it doesn't seem like anything's getting better. You're not improving, and a lot of people will stop at that point, and that's not where you want to stop. It reminded me a lot of Seth Godin's The Dip, and George Leonard says everything will contain a plateau, and the important part is to work through that and to not stop there. So just a good reminder. I mean, kind of an obvious thing, but you may see a lot of progress at the beginning when you start something. Say it's a workout routine or something, and you start feeling better and you start looking better, but then you hit a plateau. You're not moving anywhere. You're not looking better. You're not feeling better. But it's important to get through that, because then after that, and it may take a long time, there will be additional levels of progress. As you're on this pursuit of mastery, just beware that modern society is not going to help you out. He talked a lot about movies and our popular stories that we tell, and there's not many plateaus in those stories. I mean, it goes from climax to climax in movie, especially now. I mean, you contrast that with movies from 34 years ago, and they move a lot slower, and now it's like something has to blow up every five minutes, or just to keep you going. So remember that. He even talked about TV and how TV provides so many choices, and how that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, you want to limit your choices. Too many choices can be overwhelming, and the path to mastery, you want to really focus. So just beware of the excess choices, the chances for getting involved in something outside of what you want to be focusing on. Another thing, this reminded me a lot of Getting Things Done book. Set priorities by dividing them into A, B, C priorities. The A things are the things that you absolutely need to get done that day, and make sure you start with those and get them done first, and then going on to B and C. It's kind of the idea of putting the big rocks in the jar first before you try to get them in after putting in the smaller stuff. He had one section about driving as a high art, and it was really cool. I mean, he just talked about, like, before you get in the car, just walk around the car, look at the tires, like, appreciate the car. Once you sit down, like, just sit down. I mean, feel the back of the seat, feel yourself sink into the seat, grab the wheel, and be present when you're driving. And kind of that idea we've come across a lot in a lot of the books, whether it's mindfulness or just being present, like, be here now, be part of what you're doing at all times, and that can turn something as mundane as driving into a high art. At the end of the book, he talked about a judo master wanting to be buried in his white belt, and I thought that was cool. But the basic idea here is always be a beginner. Always, no matter how far you get on the path to mastery, always always think of it as a beginner. And one of the worst things that can happen on the path to mastery is thinking and not being open to new ideas or to see new things. So those are some of the things that really stuck out in the book. I wanted to tie that in with some of the other books that we've read this year, and some other ideas as well. So the first is the importance of time. Here's one quote he has on that. But the real juice of life, whether it be sweet or bitter, is to be found not nearly so much in the products of our efforts as in the process of living itself and how it feels to be alive. Another one in systems thinking, and we saw this a lot in the art of learning, and it's where, especially with chess, the way Josh Waitzkin talked about it was the numbers to forget numbers. So you basically, you learn the basics of something, and the goal is to get that into your unconscious.
To get the fundamentals so ingrained that you no longer have to think about them, that they're automatic.
And which remind, like when you were talking about the total immersion at the beginning, that's got to be a key part of it.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, Tim Ferriss has suggested from his experience that the total immersion actually was easier for him to learn to swim that way than any other way that he'd done it. Now, to get really good at that method, yeah, it takes a lot of time, and you have to focus on reducing the number of strokes per lap and all that. But the basic principles of fluid dynamics and all that, again, I haven't played around with it, all that are allegedly rather simple. But again, I don't have enough experience on that, although it is something that I want to experiment with a little bit.
Yeah. Well, cool. So along the lines of the system thinking, there's a quote Leonard has in the book. A stage ends when the habitual system has been programmed to the new task and the cognitive and effort systems have withdrawn. So this reminded me a lot of Thinking Fast and Slow as well. But a stage in the process of mastery ends when the habitual system has been programmed to the new task. So basically what we were just talking about of something moving from I've got to think about it every time I do it to the unconscious, to where it just happened. You've done it so much, you practice so much that it's moved there, and then you can go to that next step of the next step of mastery, of learning the next skill or whatever to get better, with the hope that then moves to the unconscious side of things as well. So a few other similarities to some of the other books we've read, of course, Art of Learning, the things we just talked about with the shift to unconscious, and then the War of Art. There's a lot of talk about resistance in this book. I would say the War of Art is more for creatives, kind of more along the line of Bird by Bird, whereas this book, Mastery, is more along the lines of Art of Learning, in really trying to develop a skill and get great at it.
Which to me is still applicable to creatives, but maybe a little bit more applicable beyond quote unquote creatives.
Yeah, and I think one of the main differences is the War of Art and Bird by Bird, they get more into the spiritual side of things as well, of the creative side, like, opening yourself up for something to happen through you, and for a creative force to work through you, and not necessarily for you to grit your teeth and try to make something happen. So they get more into that side of things, whereas as this book and the Art of Learning kind of stays away from the more spiritual side of creativity. Yeah,
although I would say Bird by Bird has some of that spiritual stuff as well, but the one that I would actually say is better than that on that front, that we've talked about in this podcast as well, and you can go back and listen to that one if you're interested, is Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's, of the ones that you've mentioned that have to do with creatives and all that, I would still go back to The Artist's Way before I'd go back to Bird by Bird. And I haven't done War of Art yet. You finished that long before I have even had a chance to start it. But again, I would go to The Artist's Way on that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I'd probably go with the War of Art. and so it'll be interesting to see what you say after reading The War of Art. And The War of Art was a lot shorter too. It just took a couple days for me to get through that one, and so it was a lot more pithy than Julia Cameron's. All three of them were good, but in kind of our read this, not that idea, I would put The War of Art.
Yeah, that's a segment, by the way, everybody, now that we're getting further into this, further up and further in. As we get further up and further in, you're going to see that segment from us a good bit more. Read this, not that. And this is probably our newest iteration of that.
Yeah. And that segues well into my conclusion, because I do want to hit on read this, not that, of if we're narrowing it down to two books, Mastery and The Art of Learning. I really at this point have a hard time deciding which one would be better. They were both really good, and what I liked about Mastery was that it was a lot shorter. You get through it quick. It just packs a punch. I mean, it's very well done. The Art of Learning was just it was so good though, and I loved how it was about chess and martial arts and learning process, and this guy was a child prodigy, and so yeah. So that one was really good, Art of Learning. But Mastery, it's older than Art of Learning, but it's such a short book. I mean, you can get through it really quickly, and it was timeless. It's over 20 years old, but a lot of timeless things in here. So, yeah, read both of them if you can. But overall, really good book. Really, really helpful in understanding the process of mastery, the high points, the low points, the things to look out for, and just incentives too on how to get through it. So it tied together a lot of ideas I've seen in other books, and it did it in a very thoughtful way, in a interesting way. So I'd recommend the book, but I'd also recommend The Art of Learning, and I think the two of those together are great books if you're needing just kind of a push to get moving on mastering something or learning a new skill. Any other questions you had on
No, I think you've answered everything I was going to ask. Compared to The Art of Learning and particularly The Artist's Way, those two for me were the high points so far in this genre. And I was going to ask, where would you put it on that? And you basically answered that question. So I think it's good to wrap. So once again, just a reminder, everybody, that we do have a Patreon account set up, so you can feel free to donate $10,000 a month. We're going to go ahead and anchor you to that one, to that price point, to get you psychologically in the mind to maybe think about $10,000 a month. And you could even donate 50 cents a month. Compared to 10,000 a month, that's a bargain, right? Hey, you scratch our back, we'll continue to podcast. So if you're not already subscribing, you can also subscribe to this through just about any podcast manager that exists. There are tons of different options out there for that, but also interact with us via Twitter or Instagram, all sorts of the things that the kids do these days. But aside from that, we'll go ahead and wrap it here. And once again, I'm Jason Staples. That's Erik Rostad. And we encourage you to keep reading, keep listening, and keep improving.
Go out and master something.
Thanks for listening. I made this.